My name is Charlotte Evans. I am 32, a nurse in Dallas, and at 1 in the morning I collapsed at my mother's gate. Fever burning through me. I begged for help, whispering "Mom," but she looked into my eyes, muttered, "You did this to yourself," and slammed the gate shut. Gravel cut into my skin as I hit the ground, my chest fighting for air, while across the street, a neighbor raised her phone, red light blinking, capturing the moment that would shatter everything. My shift at the Dallas Community Hospital had stretched longer than it should have, but I barely remember the hours. By the time I stepped into the parking lot, past midnight, my body felt like it was on fire from the fever. Each breath rattled in my chest, and the cold night air only made me shiver harder. I should have gone back to my apartment, but the thought of being alone in that silent place filled me with dread. Against reason, I turned the car toward the neighborhood where I grew up, convincing myself that no matter what had been said in the past, a mother would not turn her child away in the middle of the night. The streets were empty, streetlights flickering, and the hum of the engine was the only sound keeping me awake. My head pounded, and every mile felt like 10. When I finally pulled onto the cul-de-sac, relief washed over me for a moment. The Evans house stood exactly as it always had, with its manicured yard and tall iron gate. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly until my knuckles ached, trying to gather the strength to step out. I staggered up the walkway, clutching my coat tighter around me as the wind cut across my skin. My vision blurred, and the ground tilted slightly under my feet. I lifted my hand and knocked against the gate once, then again harder. My throat was raw, and when I tried to call out, only a hoarse sound escaped. The porch light flicked on, and for an instant, I believed I would be safe. The front door opened slowly, and my mother appeared, her robe tied neatly, her hair pinned as if she had been preparing for this confrontation. She did not rush forward. She stood there, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she recognized me. The silence between us stretched until she finally spoke. "You never stop bringing trouble, Charlotte." Her words stung sharper than the icy wind. I pressed my palm against the gate for balance. "Mom," I whispered, though my voice cracked so weakly it barely carried. My knees buckled and I stumbled to the ground, gravel biting into my skin. I reached one hand toward her, desperate for the smallest sign of care. For a heartbeat, her expression softened, the faintest flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Then it was gone. She shook her head, turned, and with a deliberate pull slammed the gate closed. The clang of metal echoed down the street like a final verdict. The cold seeped through my clothes as I collapsed against the pavement. My chest tightened, breaths shallow and ragged. I wanted to cry out, but the strength was gone. My last word before the darkness closed in was the same as my first, a single plea. "Mom." Across the street, Karen Lopez had been awake, finishing inventory for the small grocery store she ran with her husband. She heard the sound of metal and voices outside and stepped to her window. What she saw froze her in place. She covered her mouth, eyes wide, as I lay motionless on the ground outside the house I once called home. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, knowing that if she did not record this, no one would ever believe it. The glow of the street lamp illuminated every detail, my pale face against the dark pavement. The gate firmly closed, my mother's figure retreating back inside. Karen pressed record. The red light blinked as she captured the moment, her heart racing with disbelief. She whispered under her breath that this would change everything. As the cold night swallowed me, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly somewhere behind me. I could not tell if they belonged to my father or to a stranger passing through. The darkness pulled me under before I could find out. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, my mother would eventually look at me with the same pride she saved for my younger brother. The memory of those early years still cut sharper than the fever that burned through my body that night. My father, Robert, worked long days at a repair shop on the edge of Dallas, coming home with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. My mother, Linda, taught history at the local high school and insisted that appearances meant everything. In her eyes, Daniel, 3 years younger than me, was the shining promise of the family. When Daniel brought home a drawing from 2nd grade, she framed it and hung it above the fireplace. When I came home with a spelling bee trophy, she placed it on a shelf in the hallway where no one ever looked. The difference was subtle at first, small cuts that I tried to ignore. But those cuts grew deeper as the years passed. I remember my 10th birthday vividly. The living room was decorated with balloons, the cake still warm from the oven. Daniel, only 7, was grinning ear to ear as my mother wheeled out a brand new blue bicycle, polished and gleaming. She said he had been such a good boy, that he deserved an early present. My own gift, placed quietly on the table, was a secondhand book with a cracked spine. I smiled politely, thanked her, and later that night sat under the covers reading it by flashlight. I told myself that stories were better than wheels, but in my heart, I wished for once she would see me as worthy of something new. Christmas of 2001 sealed the truth for me. My mother had insisted on professional photos, everyone in coordinated outfits. I wore the sweater my grandmother had knitted red with little white snowflakes and waited for my turn in front of the camera. When the final photo was printed and framed, I studied it carefully. My mother, my father, and Daniel smiled perfectly at the camera in front of the tree. I was nowhere in sight. She told me later the photographer had run out of space in the frame and brushed it off with a laugh. But I knew better. I had been standing just outside the shot, asked to hold the coats. That picture still hangs in the hallway of their house, my absence screaming louder than any presence could. Those moments shaped me. By middle school, I stopped asking for attention. I poured myself into schoolwork, convinced that perfect grades might earn a nod of approval. My teachers praised me, classmates envied my report cards. But at home, silence greeted every achievement. Daniel, meanwhile, was celebrated for scoring 1 basket at a junior league game. My mother clapped louder for him than she ever did for me. There were nights I lay awake listening to the muffled conversations downstairs. I heard my mother telling my father that Daniel had potential, that he would make the family proud. About me, she would sigh and say I was responsible, that I would take care of myself. It sounded like a compliment, but felt like dismissal. Responsibility meant invisibility. Still, I clung to my father's quiet gestures. He would slip me a piece of chocolate after dinner, or pat my shoulder when I brought home a stack of straight A's. His support was wordless, hidden, and never enough to balance my mother's coldness. I learned to survive on scraps of affection. The invisible child became my role. I faded into the background during family gatherings, standing behind Daniel as he basked in attention. I pretended it did not hurt, but every time my name was skipped in a toast, or my success ignored, the pain carved itself deeper into me. I grew strong in silence, resilient in being unseen, but inside I carried the wound of never being chosen. I can still hear my mother's voice at the dinner table one night, telling Daniel that one day the house, the savings, everything would belong to him. She glanced at me only to add that I would do fine on my own. I smiled, chewed my food, and swallowed my disappointment like it was part of the meal. Those years of quiet exclusion hardened me. They built the foundation for the anger that would rise much later, when I was old enough to see her favoritism not as oversight, but as choice. And that anger, buried for so long, was waiting for the night she closed the gate on me. What I did not know then was that her favoritism would not stop at childhood gifts or holiday photos. It would follow us into adulthood, into careers and futures, into the very question of who deserved a legacy and who did not. And that truth would erupt the moment she thought she could cut me out of more than just a photograph. In 2012, I walked across the stage at the University of Texas Nursing School, with my cap slipping to one side and my heart pounding in pride. I had worked part-time all through college, taking night shifts at a diner and studying between tables. My father sat in the audience with a small smile, clapping until his hands turned red. My mother stayed home that day, telling me she was too busy helping Daniel prepare for his high school exams. I told myself it did not matter, that my new job at Dallas Community Hospital would prove my worth. The hospital became my second home. I worked long hours, 12-hour shifts where I barely had time to eat, but I loved the work. I loved holding a patient's hand when they were afraid, catching a faint smile when someone took their first steps after surgery. Every life I touched felt like something real, something lasting. But when I tried to share these stories with my mother, she only sighed. She said I was wasting my potential, wiping brows and fetching medications, that no one respected nurses the way they respected bankers or lawyers. By 2015, Daniel had joined Lone Star Bank downtown. The same week he got the job, my mother threw a dinner party inviting relatives and neighbors. She raised a glass, her voice full of pride, as she announced that her son was destined for greatness. I sat at the corner of the table, still in my scrubs from a double shift, listening to relatives toast to Daniel's bright future. No one asked me about my patients, about the night I had held pressure on a bleeding wound for 20 minutes straight until the surgeon arrived. My mother's eyes met mine once across the table, and in them, I saw only impatience, as if I were embarrassing her by not changing clothes before arriving. The distance between us grew sharper in 2018. I was in a relationship with a man named Adam, and for a time, I thought he might be my future. But the breakup was messy, public, and bitter. Adam told anyone who would listen that I was cold and difficult, that my long hours at the hospital made me unworthy of love. My mother seized on his words. At a family reunion in Houston, she spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear that I had humiliated the family, that no decent man would want me if I kept living like this. My cheeks burned as uncles and cousins pretended not to hear. I walked out onto the porch and tried to swallow the shame. Later that year, during Thanksgiving dinner, the tension boiled over. The turkey sat half-carved on the table, laughter filling the air as Daniel bragged about a promotion. My mother leaned back in her chair, smiling at him with pride, then turned to me with a pointed expression. She said that one day, the house, the savings, and everything they had built would belong to Daniel, because he had proven himself. She looked at me as if daring me to protest. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My father shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Daniel smirked, enjoying the spotlight. I forced myself to finish chewing, though the food turned to dust in my mouth. The words echoed in my head long after the plates were cleared. My mother had not only chosen him over me, she had erased me from the future of the family. I was no longer simply the forgotten daughter. I was disposable. I poured myself deeper into work, taking every extra shift offered, staying late when nurses called in sick. The exhaustion became a shield, something that kept me from feeling the sting of her rejection. Yet every time I walked into the family home for holidays, I felt the same cold wall between us. Daniel basked in their approval, while I existed only as an afterthought. It was during one of those nights, driving home from the hospital, headlights blurring on the freeway, that I realized how much the bitterness had seeped into me. I was no longer just the invisible child. I had become the unwanted woman fighting to justify her existence in her own family. And that unspoken war between us, buried under years of silence and polite smiles, was waiting for the moment when it would finally explode into something no one could ignore. The night it finally came crashing down, I could feel my body giving up long before I pulled into the familiar neighborhood. The freeway lights blurred, and I had to grip the wheel to keep myself steady. The fever had been gnawing at me since the afternoon, each step at the hospital heavier than the one before. By the time I parked near the old house in Plano, sweat was trickling down my back, even though the January air outside was freezing. I stumbled toward the gate, the iron bars looming like a wall between me and safety. My legs trembled as I pressed my palm against the cold metal. I knocked once, then twice, my voice barely a rasp as I tried to call out. For a moment nothing moved, only the low hum of a distant car passing through the cul-de-sac. Then the porch light snapped on. The door opened, and there she was. My mother stood framed in the glow, her robe tied neatly, her face composed as if she had been expecting a guest she did not want. She walked toward me slowly, each step deliberate. I forced myself upright, clutching the gate to keep from collapsing. "Mom, please." Her eyes swept over me from my sweat-soaked hair to my trembling hands. There was no concern, no urgency, only disdain. She shook her head, her voice sharp and cold. "You did this to yourself." My knees buckled and I hit the ground hard. Gravel tore at my skin and a violent cough ripped through my chest. I reached one hand out, my vision blurring as I tried to hold on to something, anything. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the sound of metal scraping as the gate closed. The clang echoed down the quiet street, final and merciless. I lay there gasping, the night pressing in around me. Every breath felt like glass in my lungs. I whispered one last plea, hoping for her to change her mind, but she had already turned away. The click of the door shutting was the only answer I received. Across the street, a faint light flickered in a second-story window. Karen Lopez, the neighbor who often worked late nights for her store, peered out and froze. I caught a glimpse of her face before my vision tunneled her eyes wide, hand pressed to her mouth. She disappeared for a moment, then returned with her phone. I heard the faint sound of her voice shaky as she muttered to herself that no one would believe this without proof. The red light of her camera blinked in the dark, capturing me sprawled against the pavement, my mother's shadow retreating back inside. The silence of the neighborhood made every sound sharper. The rasp of my breathing, the rattle of another cough, the scrape of my shoes against the ground as I tried and failed to push myself up. No one came out. No hand reached for me. The pain in my chest deepened, but sharper still was the hollow feeling in my stomach. That gate had not only shut me out of the house I grew up in, it had shut me out of any illusion that I still mattered to her at all. As my strength drained, I could barely make out the faint beam of headlights turning onto the street. Footsteps followed, hurried, firm, drawing closer to where I lay. I could not see who they belonged to, but I knew someone was finally there. And in that moment, before the darkness swallowed me again, I felt the fragile thread of hope that what came next might change everything. I woke to the sensation of strong arms lifting me from the ground, the sound of gravel crunching beneath hurried steps. My head lolled against a familiar chest, and through the haze of fever and weakness, I caught the faint smell of motor oil and aftershave. My father's voice was low and urgent as he muttered that everything was going to be all right. The cool air stung my face as he carried me toward his truck, parked at the curb. Behind us, I thought I heard my mother's voice, sharp and cold, insisting that I should be left outside to face the consequences of my choices. My father did not answer her. The slam of the truck door cut off whatever words she tried to throw after us. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments. I felt the vibration of the engine beneath me, my father's calloused hand gripping mine as if sheer force could keep me tethered. He spoke softly, almost to himself, saying he should have stepped in sooner, saying he would not let me slip away. I tried to respond, but the fever stole my words, leaving only a faint squeeze of his hand. Bright lights and rushing footsteps filled the next memory. Nurses pulled me onto a gurney, voices urgent as they checked my pulse and oxygen levels. The emergency room in Plano smelled of antiseptic and fear, a place I knew too well from years of working in one across town. For the first time, I was the one on the table gasping for air, every cough shaking me like a rag doll. A tall man with steady eyes introduced himself as Dr. Henry Clark. His words cut through the chaos. He told my father that if I had arrived minutes later, the infection could have overtaken my lungs completely. My father gripped the railing of the bed, his knuckles white. I forced my eyes open long enough to see the relief and guilt etched across his face. When I drifted awake again, the room was dimmer. Beside me sat Rebecca Miller, my oldest friend from college, and now a lawyer in Dallas. She leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, her voice calm but firm. She said I needed to remember everything, that what happened at that gate was not just cruel, but dangerous, and that I could not let it vanish into silence. She told me Karen's video already existed, and that evidence like that could not be ignored. On the other side of the room, Sophia Bennett appeared with a cup of water and a blanket she must have borrowed from the nurses. Sophia had been a newer friend, someone I met through church volunteer work, but her warmth in that moment felt like family. She squeezed my shoulder and told me I was not alone, that people still saw me, even when my own blood chose to look away. The door cracked open briefly, and I caught the sound of my brother Daniel's voice on the phone in the hallway. He was speaking to my mother, his tone mocking. He said I was exaggerating, that I loved playing the victim, that nothing serious had happened. The words burned hotter than the fever in my veins. Rebecca heard them too, and exchanged a look with me, one that said the truth would not stay buried forever. Dr. Clark returned later to check my vitals. He told me directly that I had survived by inches, that another delay might have cost me my life. His words hung in the air long after he left. My father sat quietly by the bed, his hand covering mine eyes, red as if he had been fighting tears. He whispered that he was sorry. Sorry for the years he had stood by and let my mother's cruelty define our family. Lying there with machines beeping steadily beside me, I realized the silence that had protected my mother for so long could not continue. For years I had swallowed pain, convinced myself it was better to endure than to fight. But almost dying at her doorstep, saved only because my father defied her and neighbors bore witness, shattered that illusion. I closed my eyes, gathering what strength I had left. The war between us had shifted. My mother believed she had the power to erase me, but the truth was beginning to slip from her control. And soon, the whole world would see it. The next morning I woke to the steady beep of the monitor and the muted light of winter slipping through the blinds. My body still ached, but I could feel the fever beginning to break. Rebecca was seated in the corner, scrolling on her phone, her expression tightening as she read. When she noticed my eyes open, she crossed the room quickly. She told me that Karen had made a decision. The video of my mother shutting the gate on me had been posted online only a few hours earlier. By now, half the city had seen it. I asked her what people were saying. Rebecca hesitated before answering, but then she showed me her screen. Thousands of comments poured beneath the clip, strangers, furious neighbors, horrified. Some wrote that no parent should treat a child that way. Others demanded to know how a woman who sat on the school board could live with herself. My chest tightened as I watched my own crumpled body on the screen, my mother's voice cold and final. It was painful to see, but for the first time, the cruelty was not hidden behind closed doors. By noon, reporters were parked outside our neighborhood. The local news ran the clip repeatedly, the anchor's voice heavy with disbelief. I knew my mother's phone must have been ringing nonstop. She had spent years polishing an image as a devoted teacher, a woman of faith, a model citizen. In less than a day, that image had cracked wide open. Sunday came, and I heard from Sophia that the church congregation demanded answers. My mother had always sat near the front row, nodding along to Pastor John Miller's sermons about compassion and family. That morning he called her name, his voice steady but firm. He asked if she believed she could still stand as a role model when the entire community had seen her leave her own daughter in the cold. People turned in their pews, whispering, shaking their heads. My mother did not speak. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Later that week, police officer Marcus Hill appeared at my hospital room to take a statement. His notepad rested on his knee as he asked me to recount everything from the moment I knocked on the gate to the moment I lost consciousness. His questions were precise, his tone careful. He told me that what happened could be considered neglect, causing endangerment. I signed the statement with a shaking hand, the weight of it heavy but necessary. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to push back. He called relatives and told them I had exaggerated, that I was always dramatic, that Mom was being attacked unfairly. But his words found no traction. People had seen the clip. They had heard my mother's voice clear and cruel, telling me I had done it to myself. No amount of excuses could erase it. My father stayed mostly silent. He still lived in that house, still shared a roof with the woman who had nearly left me to die. But when he visited me at the hospital, I noticed the difference in his eyes. He did not defend her anymore. He sat by my bed in quiet remorse, holding my hand, as if trying to rewrite years of silence. The school board gathered in a special meeting at the end of the week. Parents filled the room, voices rising in anger. They asked how they could trust someone who had abandoned her own child to help make decisions about theirs. By the time the meeting ended, the vote was unanimous. My mother was forced to resign her seat. Lying in the hospital bed, I felt the shift ripple outward. For years, she had held power with the force of reputation, controlling the story of who I was and who she wanted me to be. Now that story no longer belonged to her. The community had taken it into their own hands, and her perfect mask had shattered. What I did not know yet was that the video and the outrage were only the beginning. Beneath the surface, there were deeper secrets, hidden in paperwork and whispered conversations. And soon those would rise too, leaving no part of her carefully built empire untouched. Rebecca arrived at the hospital one evening with a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her expression was grim but purposeful. She sat beside my bed and told me she had gone through the courthouse archives. What she found was an older will dated 2010, drafted shortly after my father purchased the house in Plano. The document named both Daniel and me as equal heirs to everything my parents owned. Rebecca slid the photocopy across the table so I could see my father's careful signature. My chest tightened as I read the words. For years, my mother had told me I was excluded, that nothing would ever pass to me, that Daniel was the rightful heir. She had convinced me I had no claim, and I had believed her. Rebecca's voice cut through my shock. She explained that in recent years, Linda had been working with a lawyer friend to quietly draft new paperwork attempting to transfer the family home and bank accounts into Daniel's name alone. The process had not been completed, and because of that, the original will still carried full legal weight. The next week, Rebecca filed a petition with the Collin County Court. A hearing was scheduled, and subpoenas were issued requiring my mother to present every financial record she had tried to conceal. I sat in the courtroom, my body still weak, but my mind sharper than it had been in years, while my mother took the stand. She wore a pressed navy suit, her hair pinned high, but her voice wavered as she answered questions. The judge asked her directly why she had failed to disclose the original will. My mother shifted in her seat, claiming she thought it had been revoked. Rebecca rose, holding up certified documents that proved otherwise. Murmurs spread through the room, as people realized Linda had not simply overlooked the papers, but had deliberately tried to bury them. Daniel sat behind our mother, his face pale, his jaw tight. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. When the judge pressed further, asking about the attempts to transfer property, my mother faltered. Her words tangled into contradictions. Rebecca's questions cut cleanly, each one driving the truth deeper into daylight. By the end of the hearing, the judge's voice was firm. He ruled that the 2010 will was valid and binding. The estate, including the family home and accounts, belonged equally to both children. Linda was ordered to cease any further attempts to transfer assets without court approval. The district attorney announced an additional inquiry into potential fraud and misrepresentation. I exhaled slowly as the gavel struck. The weight that had sat on my chest for years lifted not because of money, but because the lies were finally broken open. My mother's mask of authority cracked in front of everyone. No longer the respected educator or admired board member she stood revealed as a woman willing to betray her own daughter for control. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, microphones thrust forward. My mother pushed past them without a word, her shoulders rigid, her eyes dark. Daniel trailed behind her, silent, refusing to look at me. Rebecca touched my arm gently, reminding me that the battle was not only about inheritance. It was about truth, and truth had finally found a voice. That night, I returned to my apartment with Sophia waiting by the door. She had watched the proceedings online and wrapped me in an embrace the moment I walked in. She told me that no one could erase me again, not after what the judge had declared. I nodded, though my thoughts were already turning to what came next. Because even as my mother's power collapsed in the courtroom, I knew the fallout had only begun. In our community, reputation was its own kind of currency, and hers was now bankrupt. The question that lingered was how far she would fall once the world realized she had nothing left to hide behind. When the court battles ended and the cameras moved on, I had to face what was left of my own life. Weeks of antibiotics and rest slowly pushed the fever from my body. I returned to Dallas Community Hospital with a stiffness in my chest, but a new steadiness in my steps. The nurses greeted me not with pity, but with pride. Patients I had once cared for smiled when they saw me in the hall. Some even whispered that they had watched the story on the news and admired my strength. For the first time, I walked those corridors feeling visible. One afternoon, as I finished checking a chart, I looked up to see my father waiting by the nurses' station. He seemed older than I remembered, his shoulders heavy, his eyes shadowed by guilt. We sat together in the cafeteria, the hum of vending machines filling the silence between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. He said he regretted every year he had stayed quiet, every dinner table, where he let my mother's words go unchallenged. He admitted that fear and habit had kept him silent, but watching me nearly die at our own gate had broken something in him. I studied the lines on his face, the sincerity trembling in his voice. I told him I forgave him, not because it erased the past, but because he was the one who carried me to safety when no one else would. His eyes watered, and for the first time in years, he reached across the table and held my hand openly. That small gesture felt heavier than any apology. Meanwhile, my mother's world shrank. The once immaculate house in Plano became a hollow shell. Neighbors stopped dropping by, friends from church avoided her pew, and the phone that once rang with invitations now stayed silent. She still carried herself with pride when she walked to the mailbox, but even Daniel had begun to keep his distance. His career at the bank suffered under the weight of whispered conversations, and he chose to step back from her shadow. Reports trickled through the community that she spent most evenings alone, curtains drawn, the television flickering against empty walls. The woman who once dictated every family tradition now had no one to share them with. And in that silence, I imagined she was left with the echoes of her own choices. For me, life began to take on a different shape. Sophia visited often, bringing meals when I was too tired to cook, and laughter when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under again. Rebecca continued to stand at my side, reminding me that truth was a form of protection as much as law. And my father called more than he ever had before, checking in after each long shift. I no longer lived in the shadow of my mother's approval or disapproval. The bitterness that once ate at me gave way to something steadier. I had learned that survival was not just about enduring pain in silence, but about choosing to stand even when others tried to erase you. On quiet nights, I would sit by my window watching the lights of the city stretch out and feel a calm I had never known as a child. The scars of what happened would not vanish, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they became proof that cruelty does not last forever, and that the truth once spoken can dismantle even the strongest walls. As I close this part of my story, I want to leave you with one thought. Families can wound us in ways no stranger ever could, but justice, whether through law, community, or the strength we find in ourselves, has a way of rising. My mother tried to strip me of dignity, of inheritance, of belonging. In the end, she was the one left stripped bare, and I walked forward carrying nothing but the truth and the people who chose to stand beside me.